just finished her PhD in Southeast Asian history at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. And her dissertation that you read a chapter of for today is about, broadly speaking, about humanitarian work during the French colonial period in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia specifically. And how to think about ideas of civilizing that we've talked about, in this class a lot, and ideas about the need to rescue people that we've talked a lot about in this class. So there's a gender component here, and her work fits very well with the themes that we've explored so far, in this class. And she's also, as you might have noticed if you looked at her introduction, perhaps, which I don't expect that you did because you only had to read chapter 1, that she also did a stint of work in Sudan, South Sudan, and in Cambodia, working for NGOs. Engaged in humanitarian work. And so one of the things that's kind of cool and exciting about Tara's work is that she brings together this kind of academic perspective, that we're used to exploring in a history class, with perspective as someone who has worked in development and worked in humanitarian, in the field of humanitarian aid. And so she brings that perspective into her questions that she asks in the historical context. Okay, so we're very lucky to have her agree to do this talk for us today, and we're going to keep this quite informal, and we'll hopefully have a lot of good discussion. We may break out into groups here, and we're going to record this session for the purposes of the class, and then we can discuss whether you feel comfortable having it posted on YouTube. On the private Asian Studies channel, or just for our group. We do not have to do that. And so if anybody does not feel comfortable, I want you guys to have a robust discussion. This is really for you. So, so if you don't feel comfortable with recording, we will not. We'll just have the recording for you to come back and look at, but we will not post it. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. So I guess we'll just have you take it away, Tara, and just let me know what you need in terms of creating, if we decide to do breakout rooms, or
right. Actually, in case we do that, could you go ahead and pre-create those rooms?
Sure. You're thinking
so that they're just all ready.
Okay, I'll do that while you're talking.
Yeah. So, hello everyone. I hope you had a nice lunch. I know it's difficult to meet after lunch. I remember that time of day. So. And I was just like, I'm ready to tune out. So, hi, thank you so much for the invitation, first of all. And thank you I'm excited to just be speaking with you again. It's been a long time since I've been in a class, real person or virtual. So I'm trying to re-exercise how to talk like this again. So, so what you had for the reading today is chapter 1 from a dissertation that I recently defended last fall. And I just wanted to give a little context about how this chapter came about. It was actually on accident. It was never planned as a part of the dissertation, and it just came into being early 2021. Because for some reasons that I'll explain a little bit later on when I talk about how I came across the particular single dossier that created this entire chapter. So I'll start now by just have a very simple slide to share with you guys. I'm not going to spend too much time lecturing, but I really want this to just be kind of more of a casual back and forth discussion about this chapter that you read. Which I'm hoping was more of an easier read. It's the shortest chapter in the dissertation. Let's see. All right, so I decided to name this How to Read a Sex Scandal because I really wanted to talk more so about this one process, which is how you get from your sources of information and turn them into narratives, into stories, into paradigms of knowledge. And also to be conscious of the steps that we make in that process. And so what today's talk will be focused on is primarily a bit of a play-by-play on what experience I went through to get from the beginning to the end of making the chapter that you read. And to go along with some of the themes that you've been discussing for this course, I'm also presenting this chapter to you as just another case study among others that you've read so far and will read later in your discussions about the politics of race and gender in colonial Asia. But first off, I wanted to just start by asking you guys just what your reaction was to this chapter and to the sex scandal that is at the center of it, which I'll primarily refer to as the Do Thiem affair. So I was just wondering if, what any of your reactions were, whether they be academic and intellectual, analytical, or even just emotional.
If you want to use your raise hand, I can call on you to help navigate.
Happy?
Can you hear me? I'm like outside right now, so.
I can hear you clearly.
Okay. Mine, when I first read the chapter, was just like a purely emotional response. When I read her letter, when she was writing to the office, I just kind of was just shocked and disgusted at what she wrote about and what she went through. I didn't really have any like academic thoughts. It was just such like a visceral reaction of like, I cannot believe, like she just went through that and that assault and nobody really listened to her. It was just really difficult to read.
Mm-hmm. All right, so is definitely emotional for you. Anyone else?
Anne, go ahead.
While I was reading through the chapter, I was kind of surprised to see the Prime Minister's argument that was pulled down later. I don't know why I wasn't expecting his argument to show through. Like, I always thought it was going to be from the perspective of Do Thiem.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we got to that part in the chapter, I was not surprised, but also just like, again, disgusted by his arguments from the contracts that he claimed, or like what was written in the contracts from his point of view. So.
Mm-hmm. All right. So it seemed like you were a little more, if you were to choose a side, you were side Do Thiem.
Yeah.
Okay. Uh-huh. Yeah. I'm curious, did anyone finish the chapter having questions or doubts, or just not fully persuaded by anyone's claims, whether they be those of the actors themselves or just a claim that I made? Luke?
More than anything, I was struck by how much was made of the question of Do Thiem's ethnicity, and how both, I believe his name was Ducot, the French official in Phnom Penh, and she and her lawyers tried to establish her Chinese ancestry because that would make such a difference in the case, I guess. I thought that was fascinating. And I was wondering whether if she had a Chinese name rather than a Cambodian name, it may have altered the outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a big fuss about, not only in her testament, but in several other documents where officials were saying, well, this is Khmer, but this is Chinese, but this is Vietnamese. And it seemed on one level, it seemed very trivial. And then yet on another level, you realize that, these racial and ethnic claims were foundational to so many of these other really tiny, tedious legal arguments that they were trying to make. I'm going to move on from here because I really want to get to these documents that you guys are mentioning already, the testament and the contract. Those are our two primary sources that I'm hoping we can get a closer look at, just to kind of see, okay, what are the two sides? What are the two stories that these that's presenting themselves that makes up this particular scandal? But first, I just want to give you a little backstory again about this dossier. So how I learned about it was that I didn't come across it myself on my own in the archive. I wasn't actively looking for it. I actually had seen it referenced in another secondary source by a historian named Trude Jacobson, who works on Cambodia. And I saw that she had mentioned, this is the part, these are like the 3 paragraphs right here from a particular article. She also mentions it in another monograph about sex trafficking in Asia, in Southeast Asia. And why I was initially attracted to these paragraphs was because I was doing research for a different chapter, which was about sexual violence and rape. And I saw that there was a reference to rape here. However, I found it, because it was very difficult to find these cases of rape or sexual violence, I thought, oh, wow, this is a pretty exceptional source, because she's discussing a testament that this young woman had written. And those types of things are just very difficult to find in official government archives in general. Like, those are not the voices that usually present themselves in such spaces. And so right here, you'll see at the end of her quotation, she had the reference for the archive. This is an archive in France, in southern France, where many people who study French colonial history go to. So I was there. I had already been doing a lot of work there. So I tried to find this one, and I did find it. And what I ended up finding was this folder here. This is the front page of the folder, and there were about 38 documents in it. These are just a little sample of those documents. And I think I forgot about this dossier for maybe 1 or 2 years. I came across it again in early 2021 when I was trying to write this article about sexual violence. And then what ended up beginning as my transcription and translation of these 38 pages turned into a completely separate chapter. Not so much about sexual violence, but more so about just politics between men, power grabbing, networks of power between the Cambodian monarchy, the Cambodian elites, and also slavery. Which was not an issue that I was thinking about at all at the beginning of me trying to map out this dissertation. And what these 38 pages basically, unveiled were a key set of documents and sources, and I'll describe those to you right now. One was Thothim's testament that some of you have already mentioned and brought up, which was written in French. And then, so written in French, obviously by a scribe, so not by herself, because she would not have been able to write it herself. Another was her genealogy. It was just a piece of paper, you saw it in the chapter, that was mapping who her relatives were on her mother's and father's side, mapping out her ethnic claims. And then a ton of documents that were back and forth between 4 French officials. This judge that was in Phnom Penh, who she first reached out to, this prosecutor who was in Saigon, Paul Dumais, who was the governor general of all of Indochina during this time, very, very important guy during the late 19th, early 20th century in French Indochina. And then also resident superior Antoine Ducot, who was in Phnom Penh. So you could compare him as, like, if you have governors of states in California, not California, governors of states in the US, he was the governor of Cambodia at this time. So back and forth between these 4 men. And they were very mixed up. I was trying to figure out the timeline. It ended up being just over a very short period of time between June and July. And I could also see that there was also some geographic mapping going on. So right here, the top point of interest, this is the home village of where Thothim is. It's a province just north of Phnom Penh, where there was historically quite a large Chinese and Vietnamese ethnic community in Cambodia for hundreds of years. They were primarily the traders and the merchants in Cambodia during this time, whereas Cambodians were usually subsistence farmers. So that is where Thothim was born. From there, when she was 11, was when she moved down here to Phnom Penh, which you can get to quite quickly along the Mekong. And then right here in Saigon, it is where those 2 other French officials would have been, that prosecutor Assou, and then Paul Dumais, the governor general. So there's this kind of, so you can get a sense of this triangulation of movement that's going on. It's not just taking place in Phnom Penh at this moment. So from there, I wanted to go straight into this little activity of looking at these two sources that we had just brought up. And Professor Theis, did you have the small groups?
They're there. Yeah,
Okay.
they're created. Are they not?
Great.
Did you guys get I haven't done a ton of break rooms.
I saw a little notice. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to drop 2 documents into the chat box right now. And for about perhaps 15 minutes or so, first, let me do that before I keep talking. Okay, yeah, for about 15 minutes or so, I would like for you in your group to read the document. It looks like lots of pages, but you could just stick to the English part. Disclaimer, the English is my own translation. So, it's been through a filter, which was mine.
So you guys can see groups that you're in, right? Is that correct? Okay.
So the first group, you'll have this document, which is Thotim's Testament. And the second group will have the second document here, which is the Oknya, the Prime Minister's contract. And in each one, you'll see, I'll just share my screen really quick so I can go over it really quick with you.
So I think you guys have to click to join your group.
Yeah. Before you do, let me just quickly explain the directions. So I just want you guys together to read the document. And then in about 3 sentences together, summarize the facts of the case, just based on that document, not try to screen out whatever else you read in the chapter. And then also note any references to race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, class that's in that document. And then also think about some of the questions or comments that you have about that the source leaves you with. And then after that, I'd like for us to come together and to compare these 2 perspectives of the affair. And see how they measure up against each other. This is just a chance for you to get a little bit more into the deep reading line by line of what's going on in the language and how each side is presenting the case itself. And if you have any questions, just pop them into the chat box. We can keep this, active and dynamic, and it, we'll play it by ear.
Seem clear? So you guys go ahead and jump into your groups. Do you see a prompt for that?
No.
How do I?
It's in the bottom if you click breakout rooms.
Yeah, so I've got
Click
that.
it and then you can join it.
Oh yes, everybody should click
Yeah,
breakout
if you click breakout room.
and then just hit join to join.
Click what?
On the bottom of your screen, there's a it says breakout rooms. So click on that.
Join breakout room.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so I tap that.
Yep, tap that, and then you're in your group.
So now what do I do? It says join. Now it says room 1. You have been assigned to breakout room.
So you should be in a room
I just see.
with Abby. Somehow you're not in your room. Actually, I don't think you joined, actually, Linda. So click the blue join button. Do you see a blue join button?
No, I just say it says join breakout room. Maybe I should have clicked it twice. Oh, this one. Okay, got it.
Got it? Let's see.
Yeah, I was still in the bottom part.
Okay. Go for it. Oh, and it looks like it got uneven because
It's okay.
Jake and Loriana can
Yeah.
do that's fine.
On the script. And then 2, there were words there that they just weren't really familiar with because they're just not in the everyday parlance, jargon of contemporary Khmer. So I think are we all back now?
I think so. Can I ask a question about the translation and the sources?
Yes.
Why would some parts of the file be in Khmer and some parts in French?
Those that were in French, majority of them were written by the French officials. So most of which in the civil service were not literate in Khmer. If they could speak and listen, they might not have been able to read and write. Totim's testament is in French because my assumption is that because she wanted to give it to the French judge. So she would have had someone, my guess is someone who was perhaps Chinese Khmer in the community who was educated, a scribe, and someone with some legal experience to help her compose that and then submit it. But that contract, the reason why it was in Khmer, the Oknyas contract, those of you who saw that, it was because it was written by the Oknya and another one of the ministers on the Council of Ministers. And it was not meant to be given to a French official. It was just supposed to be terms of understanding between him and Totim's parents. So that was the reason why that was in Khmer.
Okay. So there's no indication that Totim spoke French?
There's no indication. And my assumption would be that she did not. She would not have, right? Because really the only children who were getting any education, Khmer children who were getting education, would have typically been boys because they went to the monastery, right? Not girls. And public education for both boys and girls didn't begin really until more into the early 20th century in Cambodia. And even then it would have only been a certain class of children, those of the elite. All right, so we're all back. I was wondering, so let's start with those questions that were at the beginning of that exercise. And those of you who read document 1, Totim's testament, how did you summarize just the facts of the case just based on her testament? What happened?
Well, first of all, the prime minister went to the family and pretty much said that she was desired by him, and that the mother of what's the girl's name? Can't pronounce it. What is it? Sophie. Anyway, so the mother felt like she couldn't say no, so she was taken by him, and as a dancer initially, and then she says that he chose her to be a concubine, and she refused him, and he continued to abuse her, locked her up, chained her up, and until she finally gave in. At one point, the prime minister's wife went and got her back when she ran away. So she was beaten and locked up and chained, and he forced himself on her.
Great. So generally we have a very dramatic story. There's a lot of impassioned language, I think, that you might have picked up on. It's inarguable just based on this testament that she is the victim and he is the perpetrator. He's a monster, he's a beast, he's painted as a 72-year-old, man who's a creep in a way, at least from our perspective, especially. How about the Oknyas contract? What does the whole affair look like from the perspective of the contract?
Well, it says it was at the request of the parents that she becomes a dancer for Okna, and it's kind of like it's a freeing contract. Like she could leave, like the parents could take her back if they felt uncomfortable with her situation, but we had definitely a lot of questions about that line. So
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Anything else about the contract you picked up on? It was very different from the
Luke,
testament.
go ahead.
Well, just like evaluating the relative strengths and weaknesses of the two sources, the fact that it was a contract and presumably signed by both parties
Mhm.
makes, like, in some sense, stronger. And the fact that it was older.
Yes, it was older. Although when I was reading that source, I was thinking, did they backdate this? Or like, I just had all these questions in my head. Maybe they were trying to defend themselves, because the thing about this contract is that I'm not sure how, when I was trying to arrange, like, you know, the timeline of all the paperwork in that dossier, I couldn't figure out who gave that contract to who at what point in time. That's one detail that I couldn't figure out. You know, was it just like who had it? Like, because it was just the contract. There wasn't an attachment or cover that said, you know, hi, my name is Bob, I'm giving this to Tom and it's Monday. It was just floating in the dossier. So it was hard for me to, one, kind of believe the authenticity of it, and two, understand the transaction, the context of its transaction. So yeah, that was another thing. What you mentioned earlier about the contract, it really paints it to be quite a good deal, was what my reading of it was, if I was just to take it for face value. The person that I was having a conversation with, who helped me with some of the transcription and translation, said something that really, you know, that really surprised me in our discussion. He said, you know, this makes him look like a good guy. He's just trying to help out his relatives, whether they be blood relatives or distant relatives, because they're poor. And actually, this contract does more for them than it does for him, is what this guy was saying, was telling me. They're getting way much more. Her parents, Thotim's parents and Thotim, are getting way more out of this contract than he is. If anything, he's the benevolent patron, according to this dossier. I mean, according to this contract. And so I didn't actually, by the time I came to the realization of what was in the contents of the contract and how it disputed Thotim's testament, I had already translated everything else and thought I sorted it out. And then that contract came in and I thought, great, this really messes things up. So what happened? I don't know. But clearly there are many different interpretations as to what happened. That of Thotim herself, you know, in her own voice, apparently. That of the contract disputing just the terms of the beginning of the arrangement. And then also the different ways in which the officials were trying to interpret the situation. And knowing that they probably are lacking, and there are a lot of linguistic and cultural barriers that are between them and trying to understand what's going on. And then on top of that, there's us in 2022 with all of these certain notions about, you know, what is unjust and just and fair and feminism and human rights, etc., the law, crime and punishment. So I got to a point where I had decided, look, I'm not a judge here. The point of writing this chapter was not for me to determine who had committed what crime, but more so, why are they choosing to say the things that they are saying? What is it about the particular political, social, economic climate at this time that is perhaps making one certain individual taking this side versus another, besides for these are the facts that they have? Perhaps that there are other reasons, and there always are, especially in a sex scandal. And to give you a little bit more like understanding about what that context is, let's just return. I'm gonna just do a little quick hold on, talk again. We'll return back to the slides to give you some context on what was going on in Cambodia during the late 19th century. Let's see. which came up a bit in the chapter, but I'll just review it a bit more. So we have these two documents. We're wondering why are people thinking different things about what's going on, including the French officials. And one important thing to understand is that Cambodia during the late 19th century, it officially became a protectorate of the French Empire in 1863. And by nature of being a protectorate, it wasn't a full colony. It was supposed to have a bit more autonomy. That's why the king was still there. That's why Cambodian elites like this Okanya, the prime minister, could still exert power. And they did have control and authority over certain domains and affairs in Cambodia. But the French were still there and had domain over other areas. So if you can imagine it, say like a Venn diagram or something, Cambodian actors had control over certain things, French actors had control over other things. And slowly over the course of the 19th century, as we go into the 20th, the French essentially begin to expand their domain, their jurisdiction over certain matters. And it's during this time of this expansion of French jurisdiction over what had traditionally been in the power of Cambodian monarchy and elites that this entire scandal takes place, and explains why the prime minister might have done what he did and the officials took the sides that they did. So what is happening, right? What sets the scene for what's happening at this time is that during the 70s and 80s, there's a lot of popular uprisings that happen across Cambodia, mostly in rural settings, because people, peasants mostly, who are rallied by the Okanyas or higher elite, who are their patrons, are opposing many of French interventions and reforms that are taking place during this time. The most well-known of these rebellions was one that took place in between 1884 to 1887. And what happened after that was the French bureaucrats and officials at the time realized, okay, we can't piss them off that much because they can do things like, rebel across the entire protectorate and cause a lot of problems for us. So we need to have a little bit more of a cautious approach in terms of expanding colonial power, expanding colonial jurisdiction, yet also being firm about it. And how do we do that? Well, let's just break up what have been these traditional threads between the institution of the monarchy and the institution of the elites. So one strategy of French officials during this late 19th century period was to try to break those ties of loyalty between the monarchy, symbolized by the king, and then between all of these elites, symbolized by people like the Okanya, who were not necessarily royalty, they were more so royally appointed. And the Okanya is an example of those people. Cambodia still has many of those Okanya today. Some of them claim their title not necessarily by the king, but just because they've assumed enough, social or economic capital. And what happens during this time is that the Okanya comes in while the French are passing many laws that take away a lot of powers from King Norodom, who you see here on the right. He was the king who had ruled from 1864 to 1990. Hold on. Okay, not the exact dates, but 1860s to early 1900s. And during especially the 80s and the 90s, his executive powers had really, really shrunk. So for example, he didn't have any power over the collection of taxes, for example, or over the administration of land property rights. Those had gone to the French at that time. The French had also taken over a lot of bureaucracy and administration. Here on the left, you can just a quick map and a sense of Phnom Penh at the moment in 1885, which was about 2 years before Thotin moved to Phnom Penh. So that's just a general landscape of what's going on during this time when the affair is taking place. So you have these French officials, you have such as the four men that we see in this chapter, and then you have Cambodian elites such as the prime minister. Well, perhaps without the context, you would think, oh, they'd be really against each other, right? Because colonial subjects are against colonizers and they're just natural enemies. However, one thing that I found out much, much later while writing this while writing this chapter was that I did not know that the prime minister was actually very close to Resident Superior Ducos. In the entire dossier, you never see the prime minister's name. You just see him either referred to as Oknya, which is it's not a formal name like, Tara. It's just a title. Or you see the word prime minister. The name actually never ever appears in the dossier. So I only found that out because I found out who was the prime minister at the time that the affair took place in another piece of secondary literature. And interestingly, in that first reference that I found to this case in True Jacobson monograph, she thought that the prime minister, or this Oknya, was another minister, not the highest prime minister. So there are 5 ministers in Cambodia who are usually the advisors of the king during this time. There's the prime minister, who's the top guy, and then there's other ministers who are in charge of other things like minister of war, minister of culture, et cetera, et cetera. This guy was the top one. Jacobson had said that he was some other minister. So that was another piece of confusion and something to clarify again further. But once I found out that this particular Oknya was Prime Minister who was basically supposed to be the right-hand man of the king, but then cut ties with him and allied more closely with the French resident superior, Ducos, things made a lot more sense. You could start to understand why Ducos, of the 4 French officials, would be the one to be more willing to collaborate instead of be in conflict with He would be the one who would be thinking, okay, well, we've just had all of these rebellions during the 80s. We don't want that again. However, we do want to keep maintaining the expansion of French projects and programming in Cambodia. So if there's this potential scandal of this woman who is saying that she was abused by the prime minister, who is my ally, am I going to, rat him out, or am I going to protect him? What do you think? Going to protect him, or at least try to keep things quiet and contained. And I wish that I could have tried to find out if any information about this scandal had breached what had been a very small bubble. For example, if I wanted to do some more digging, we could try to look into other parts of the archives to see if were people even talking about it outside of, what was the royal palace and what were the elite quarters of Phnom Penh at this time, or was it kept under wraps? I'm not sure. But the officials really wanted to keep it on the down low and try not to let it expand much, because they wanted to protect and they wanted to protect just stability in the kingdom and continue to allow the expansion of these French programs, of these French policies, of French executive powers, and also keep people calm and not let them get angry. So meanwhile, they're also at the same time preaching these ideologies of humanitarianism, of emancipation, of getting rid of slavery, of getting rid of barbarism and savagery, and bringing Cambodia from this backward state into this enlightened state like other modern Western nations. So you can see that these are the politics at place here, trying to institute all of these modern reforms, yet also protect their interests so that they can stay there longer and hopefully get to, bringing those reforms about eventually later on. So generally, yeah, these are the 2 things that I was seeing coming into play. This dance between clash and then also compromise, which I think we'll get to this later. But I wanted to ask you guys just about the politics of the sex scandals in more recent times, and I think that you'd find these similar themes in other case studies in other similar case studies as well. But just to close up this discussion for now, and to round it out now that you have a bit more context, I wanted to ask you to to rethink, okay, what your take on the Totim affair would be, who you believe, and if you feel like you need more facts, knowing while carrying all those perhaps emotional predispositions that you had about the document, about the chapter, about the testament, but then also understanding some of the context of what was happening. Does it change, does knowing a little bit more about what was going on and understanding some of the stakes that French officials were facing, you know, trying to keep things calm, yet also trying to bring about reform? Because some of these men, like the judge, at least in the language of his letter, seemed quite earnest about just things like justice and freedom. Yet he also wanted to tread lightly. Yeah, I'm just wondering if that might change any of your, say, sympathies, or, you know, reduce some of the disgust that you had.
I would really like to know more about the parameters of the contract. Now, where was it registered? Obviously, it might not have been notarized. Who held it? That type of thing, you know? I mean, was it just a kind of a written pact between the parents and this ogre? Or was there actual legal parameters in which it was done? It didn't sound as, I didn't see anything in my reading, of course, maybe I missed it, that it had been accepted, sanctioned by, say, the Cambodian government, or any kind of jurisdiction legally. Maybe it's because I know that everything that I have to deal with has to be, you know, cross the T, dot the I, etc. And by golly gumdrop, if you don't have a notary on that, then it's just not valid. So
yeah, no, I had some of those questions too, as to how legitimate is this document? I mean, there's this seal on it. I don't know, but
they could have put the seal on it.
Yeah, that requires also looking into, so during this time, there was this set of laws, indigenous codes called the Cambodian Code. And those were, it was basically just the constitution, for so-called constitution in Cambodia. So there were laws that ruled, for example, contracts that were made between masters and slaves and their families. And those are quite tedious. A French scholar translated them into French during the late 19th century, and in trying to understand what some of these Cambodian customs were. But whether or not those laws and customs were regulated and enforced is questionable, especially when you realize that there are lots of levels and scales as to which people would have even known about these laws and whether they would have been regulated depending on your location in the country, right? But there would not have been, some central housed building in Phnom Penh that kept all these contracts and notarized them and made sure that they were, authentic and legal. So, but yes, there are lots of questions that the contract, among many other sources in the document, in the dossier, leave us with.
Anne, did you have a hand up there?
Oh, that was basically like my questions too, and like concerns about the legitimacy of the contract and how it was potentially manipulated in favor of the prime minister. But like we've seen like time and time again and throughout history where like contracts and different laws were enacted, but like they didn't really reflect the social context of the time period, you could say. Like in our group, we were like talking about Japanese comfort women and how like they were first approached with this like contract of, oh, you're going to get a job like in these factories and it's going to help your family. But in actuality, they were like sent to these comfort homes. So yeah, it just like reminded me of that.
Mm-hmm. So I'm hearing a lot of this questioning of the contract, and I'm wondering if anyone was questioning the testament.
Luke, go ahead. Yep.
Not necessarily questioning the testament. I was just, I'm curious what motivations you think the French-speaking, legally educated people who helped her write it might have had. Like, do you think they were French or Cambodian? Was she paying them? Why would they want to be part of this?
They being perhaps the officials she was appealing to?
No, because if I'm not mistaken, it was like the testament was written in French by like a lawyer for Toteem, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're not exactly sure of this person's name or identity, but if you look at the original archival document, which was at the end of that, was 4 pages of it. It was on stationery that had 3 languages on it: French, Chinese, and Vietnamese. And I was told by some others that the language just indicated that it was notarized by perhaps a Chinese notary to authenticate the document. So that made me think she went to someone in the Chinese community, since she had some Chinese heritage, who had some legal knowledge or who was educated in some way and would be able to compose, an elegant, grammatically correct French letter. So not sure who, we just, those are just, some guesses as to who was writing it for her. But your question was, could you repeat your question again? Like, what were some of her motives?
Or just like the motives of I mean, that sounds reasonable that it was some educated person in the Chinese community. Just curious what they would be motivated by in helping her.
Right, I don't know, does anyone have any guesses on that? I mean, they would be paid probably, so there's a fee, unless they were just very nice and wanted to help girl out.
Or unless they were politically interested. This was one of my theories, that I mentioned to you, that,
right,
is it, I still find, much as I sympathize with a young woman like Toteem, potentially it still seems really unusual, shall we say, for an illiterate woman of her stature to initiate this kind of legal proceeding.
mm-hmm.
So it makes me wonder whether there were other players either within the palace, or within her family or somewhere, who would have had it in their interest to try to launch this campaign against the prime minister.
Yeah,
actually, and none of that is to say that she was not abused, because of course the abuse is probably more common than than not in these situations. But go ahead. Yeah.
No, that was no, I'm glad you brought that up, because if you'll recall in the chapter, I believe at some point, Ducos, remember the French resident superior, who's defending and doesn't really he speaks about Toteem in a not so very compassionate way, or sympathetic way. He theorizes, or he doesn't theorize, he argues that what she is doing is just some plot with some other people in the palace, that is among the monarchy, like to try to take down the prime minister, because he's now kind of leaving the king and moving more towards the French officials, and they don't like that. So they see the prime minister, the Oknya, as this man who's just taking political advantages and trying to play whatever side will get him power and money. And so Ducos is saying, this is just that these are just palace intrigues and the politics and petty games of the Cambodian elite. That's all. That's what he was, at least.
It's a theory.
Yeah, it is a theory. Yeah, did anyone else have, again, back to the testament, did anyone else question parts of the testament? Because I think it's quite perhaps naturally easy to question the contract, because the Oknya does seem like, an ogre compared to this much more lengthy, clear, melodramatic testament.
Mm-hmm. Anybody?
Well, I'm surprised she lived myself. After undergoing all that for so long, it seems really amazing that not only did she live, but she had her brains left to mount this rebuttal against her abuse. Anyway, that's just ran through randomly. So,
Christine, you have a hand up too there.
Yeah, I was just gonna say the only thing that it's not necessary. I don't doubt Totim's testament. I think the only thing I wasn't sure about was her background because of the conflicting ideas about like whether she was actually Chinese or not. Because I think it could be argued that maybe she made that up in order to take her testament to a French court, but I don't think that makes her testament like untrue. Like I still think that the abuse that probably happened, and yeah, but that was the only thing that I was like unsure about, but it didn't make me believe her less.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up again, because we did bring it up earlier in the session about this whole, we haven't even touched on this whole element about her claims, her ethnic claims to being Chinese. And it's interesting that in order to claim freedom and justice and protection, she is essentially trying to say, hey, I'm an outsider, I'm a foreigner, I'm not one of you guys, so you can't treat me like one of you guys. Whereas usually, I guess maybe the opposite usually takes place, where you want to claim that you are included in this community, you are a citizen, you are a resident or whatever, in order to claim protection underneath whatever domain you live. But in this case, Totim is saying, I'm not Cambodian. So one, I shouldn't even be a slave or, under debt bondage. At least that's what she's saying. And two, like even I can take a Cambodian court cannot, or Cambodian laws and codes cannot judge me because I exist under a different jurisdiction. And it's interesting to see them, each of the officials, kind of either just ignore that element of her argument or just try to argue around it, like Duclos, who's saying, actually, she's Khmer. I mean, like, she doesn't even know who her father is, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, it doesn't even seem to matter what her race or ethnic-based claims are, because there are other larger politics at play that the officials need to preserve. I know we're getting closer to 120, to 220 or whatever time it is there. So I just want to check in real quick.
We can, I think, run over a few minutes if people finish out.
No.
We don't have to worry too much about the
Okay. Well, the last another kind of concluding question I wanted to throw out there was whether anything in this chapter and our discussion today makes you overlaps with more recent 21st century affairs and sex scandals that you might have been following in the news on your own, and whether it's made you think about it differently or not. There's one in my mind, but I'm just wondering if you guys have thought about anything else in reflection on this particular affair.
Hey, Tara, why don't you pop off screen share so that people can see?
Oh, yeah.
Final this. There we go.
Because I'm thinking about feng shui values. Not exact same case, but a case of a woman who comes out, who has a testament against someone who is in a very, very high position of power. I haven't done, I haven't written a chapter on it, so I haven't done much analysis beyond that.
Do you all see parallels there?
Definitely. It seems like a similar thing happened where political forces kind of like coalesce to silence talk on the subject, and just in the interest of stability.
Other,
Well, it took Prince Andrew a long time to get accused. There were lots of dodges there. And it's obviously the photographs and all the other, so I say, supporting facts. And yet, what? That's been going on for a long time now. That's, might makes right. He had a lot of money. He was protected. And now he's not. But it's the same dynamic. No, not the same dynamic. It's a related dynamic where a normal person would have been nailed to the cross already on something like that with child abuse. Whereas he's been dancing on this, for at least 6 years anyway.
I think it's interesting to in the case of Peng Shuai, that's an interesting comparison because the arguments about that case, there were people, not just women, who were concerned about her well-being and concerned about the facts of sexual assaults. But those were not concerns shared by either the Chinese government or the IOC. That in the end, both the Olympic authorities and the Chinese government had very different political agendas. I guess that's where I see the closest parallel with To Tim's case.
That's stronger parallel.
It's not just the classic story of a powerful man abusing a weaker woman, a woman of less status, female, etc. But the fact that the powers that be were not of the same mind about this, but that for neither set of powers, male powers, the IOC or the Chinese government, the French officials, or the Cambodian royal establishment, nobody cares about the content of the case. It is a question of how to resolve it for the best political outcome, for stability, for other things. Which reminds me of one thing that we've talked a lot about in this class, where something to do with women, their abuse, their rescue has nothing to do with women at all. That women become, and their need for reform or rescue or their violence perpetrated against them is simply the grounds on which we have powerful political forces arguing about other things.
No, I think that's a really important point to make too, because I think I said this, I might have said this in one statement in the chapter, but one thing that I found was that while there was so much paperwork and documentation and letters produced from these officials in response to her testament, rarely ever did they focus on the actual act of rape or locking her up. More so, they dwelled on other issues. That seemed to be very marginal to the discussion itself. It was a part of it and it instigated it, but it was very marginal to the larger debates that they were having about her Chinese identity or the law or the contract or, what did her parents agree on? Not really talking about, hey, this woman says that she was raped and locked up. Moving on from there.
Right.
In a way, that wasn't even a point of dispute or something to agree or disagree on. It was just, actually, there's this going on instead that we want to talk about.
Yeah, interestingly, I suppose you could also argue that everyone could agree that she was sexually abused. That was a moot point because, of course, she was a slave. She was in bondage to this powerful man, and the contract, of course, is not about her consent, right? So it's not, her consent is irrelevant, in that context. So they could all of the surrounding powers could agree on the facts and yet not care about them, in a way. Some of you had a few other questions that you posted in your for the discussion prompt. Did you get all your questions answered? Other people have lingering thoughts, comments?
I don't know if you would necessarily know the answer to this one, but because of Cambodia's status as a protectorate and their more autonomous nature, and how did this case impact the ethnic Chinese semi-autonomous nature within that semi-autonomous state already?
Right. No, that's a really great question. So, Cambodia was a protectorate, yes, in name. However, what happened in 1884, right before these big rebellions, is that there was a convention that King Norodom was narrated to have been forced to sign, that made Cambodia essentially a de facto colony. So while protectorate in name, it lost, the king and lost all powers to, as I said before, administer taxes, to be in charge of the land, to run significant parts of the economy, so that there was very little that was left in his jurisdiction and in Cambodian jurisdiction. And meanwhile, during this whole time, for a very, very long time, there is an ethnic Chinese community in Cambodia and across the rest of, Indochina as well, who have been living there and working there and intermarrying with ethnic Khmer, with ethnic Vietnamese and other ethnic groups in the area. The French recognized this when they arrived, and they allowed, because they were such deeply entrenched, somewhat independent enclaves that could function on their own, they allowed them this legal autonomous status. So they were called these Chinese congregations. And this status continued over time. So for example, with prostitution, they could have their own laws regarding prostitution that were separate from whatever rules the French brought in. And those seem to continue into the early 20th century. So that's why it would have been very, very advantageous for her to claim asylum, you could say, underneath, a Chinese community, say, you can't touch me, because I'm part of these people.
Other questions, comments, observations? So far, so good. All right. Well, it's 3:28, so we should probably bring things to a close here. Thank you very much, Tara, for sharing your sources with us and your insights. A lot of food for thought, fits in very well with a lot of the themes we've been talking about in this class. So, yeah. Now, if you guys get curious, you can read the rest of her dissertation.
Thank you for your clarity.
Thank you, everyone. It was nice meeting you all. And I hope you have a nice spring break, I guess, right?
Yes, spring break coming up next week, although I'm going to see you on Thursday before we get to that.
Right.
So
yeah,
we're not breaking yet.
Not yet.
All right, everybody. We'll see you on Thursday.